We're going to get started and let some stragglers wander in as they might. Welcome to the Library of Virginia. I'm Audrey McElhenney, the Senior Rare Book Librarian. On the eve of the last presidential debate, which is scheduled for tonight in Las Vegas, no less, we give you 3 elections that remade Virginia, presented by Trenton Hizer in celebration of Archives Month. Trenton is the Library of Virginia's Senior Manuscripts and Digital Cataloging Archivist. He received his Bachelor of Arts degree from Old Dominion University in Norfolk, his Master's of Arts degree and PhD from the University of South Carolina in Columbia. Trenton is also the editor of this, the Guide to Personal Paper Collections at the Library of Virginia, which we'll have out if anyone wants to take a look at it. Please join me in welcoming Trenton.
Thank you. The book makes an excellent doorstop, killing small bugs, things like that. The 1902 Constitution capped a 3-decade effort by the Virginia Democratic Party to capture and keep control of state government. The Constitution effectively disenfranchised African American and poor white voters, completing a trend that started in the 1880s. Shrinking the size of the electorate allowed a state democratic machine to control the 3 state offices of governor, lieutenant governor, and attorney general, as well as U.S. senator, even after direct election was implemented in 1913. The upshot of this was that the candidate who won in their Democratic primary won the general election. Only in the western 6th and 9th congressional districts and in the 10th congressional district in northern Virginia did the Republican Party successfully compete for office. Harry F. Byrd perfected this democratic organization, controlling not only state offices, but many county-level governments as well. The aptly named Byrd organization dominated Virginia politics from the 1920s to the 1960s. When the U.S. Supreme Court ordered school desegregation in 1954, Virginia, at Byrd's insistence, pardon me, page got out of order. Page got lost. Everything was going so well up to this point. All right. Sorry. Let me get back here. All right. While the state Democratic Party controlled Virginia, it lost step with an increasingly liberal National Democratic Party. Byrd and his organization opposed the New Deal as an overreach of the power of the federal government. And in 1948, when the National Party inserted a civil rights plank in its platform, Byrd resisted bolting the party as many other Southern politicians did, but he did not support the National Party after this. When the U.S. Supreme Court ordered school desegregation in 1954, Virginia, at Byrd's insistence, implemented massive resistance. Several school districts shut down rather than admit African American students, but this policy failed in 1959 when Byrd loyalist Governor J. Lindsay Almond reopened the closed schools. Massive resistance and its end led to fissures within the state Democratic Party. In the 1960s, many political machinations used to suppress voter turnout, such as the poll tax, were overturned. The Byrd machine now faced a larger, more uncontrollable electorate, including African Americans determined to flex their political muscle after years of oppression. After Byrd's death in 1966, the machine collapsed and Virginia politics altered. The Democratic primary no longer guaranteed success in the general election. The Virginia Republican Party was now able to compete beyond its traditional mountain valley borders. Both parties were transformed by the political upheaval of the 1960s, and both were remade. The changes both underwent were highlighted by their respective candidates for governor in 1973, Mills Godwin and Henry Howell. Both Godwin and Howell were from Tidewater. Godwin was born in 1914 in Chuckatuck in Nansemond County. Howell, Godwin's junior by about 6 years, was born in 1920 in Norfolk. Both Howell and Godwin attended the Norfolk Division of the College of William and Mary, now Old Dominion, and both received law degrees from the University of Virginia. Godwin and Howell entered Virginia politics through the Democratic Party after World War II. And there the similarities between the two men vying for the 1973 gubernatorial election ended. In 1947, Godwin decided to run for the Nansemond County, Suffolk seat in the House of Delegates, held by a Byrd organization loyalist. Godwin won the Democratic primary, guaranteeing his victory in the general election. Because he had defeated a Byrd organization stalwart, Godwin's reception by the Democratic leadership in Richmond was cool, but he eventually won his way into its good graces. In 1952, Godwin easily won election to the 5th District State Senate seat. And Godwin proved to be a loyal Byrd organization politician in the Virginia Senate and was key in implementing Harry Byrd's massive resistance strategy to federal court-ordered integration. Godwin parlayed his position as a Byrd lieutenant into the Democratic nomination for, and therefore election as, lieutenant governor in 1961. This office served as a stepping stone to the governorship in 1965. In 1964, Godwin had supported Lyndon Johnson for president, a move that did not sit well with many of Virginia's conservative Democrats because of the National Party's support of civil rights. However, Godwin was unopposed in the Democratic primary. In the general election, he ran against Republican Linwood Holton and William J. Story of the Virginia Conservative Party, a party created to give Virginia conservatives an alternative to the Republican Holton and the apparent apostate Godwin. Now, Godwin was the last governor of the Byrd organization, and in his election were sown the seeds of its demise. Godwin tallied a comfortable victory over Holton and Story. In office, Godwin knocked down some of the last bastions of the Byrd organization by appointing African Americans to state public boards and commissions, advocating a sales tax, and abandoning Byrd's pay-as-you-go philosophy. His opponent in 1973, Henry Howell, was the antithesis of Godwin, the machine politician. He became involved in politics as a supporter of Francis Pickens Miller of Fairfax County, the anti-Byrd organization candidate for governor in 1949. As a lawyer in the 1950s and 1960s, Howell battled big business and its perceived ally, the State Corporation Commission, and often supported labor and its rights to organize. Opposed to massive resistance, he fought to reopen Norfolk's public schools in 1959. Supporting integration and civil rights, Howell also helped abolish the poll tax to the courts. If Godwin represented the Virginia Democratic Party's past, Howell seemed to be its future. A brash populist who supported the liberal causes that many Virginia Democrats opposed, Howell ran as an unabashed liberal for the House of Delegates, losing in 1953 and 1961, and winning in 1959 and 1963. He later won election to the Virginia Senate from the 2nd District representing Norfolk. In the Assembly, Howell drew great support from those very people who were seemingly blocked from political power, blacks and poor whites. Promising to, quote, keep the big boys honest, Howell finished a close second in the three-man Democratic primary in 1969, forcing a runoff. In the primary, Howell took 38% of the vote to William C. Battle's 39%, but Battle won the runoff 52% to 48%. This bruising primary led to Battle's defeat by Linwood Holton in the general election in November, giving the Republican Party its first governor in the 20th century. Howell followed his impressive showing in the primary with a greater political win in 1971. Democratic Lieutenant Governor J. Sargent Reynolds died of a brain tumor on June 13th. A special election was called for November 2nd to fill the rest of Reynolds' term. A rift appeared in the Republican ranks over who to nominate, and the moderate freshman delegate George R. Shafran was eventually chosen over the candidate from the more conservative branch of the party. This split seemed insignificant compared to that in the Democratic ranks. Howell bolted the party to run as an independent, believing that he could win outside the party. By winning election as lieutenant governor, he believed he would have a better chance of securing the nomination for governor 2 years later. The Democratic convention settled on George J. Costell of Clifton Forge, then serving his fifth term in the House of Delegates. In the general election, Howell defeated his two opponents, claiming 40% of the vote. Kostel finished second, claiming 36.1% of the vote, and Republican Shaffron finishing a poor third with 23.1% of the vote. The 1971 election set up the 1973 gubernatorial election to be one of the most significant elections in Virginia history. Howell was in an unusual position. When he ran for lieutenant governor as an independent, he stated that he would run for governor 2 years later. During his tenure in the second office, Howell's allies within the Democratic Party gained control of the party, and the Democratic nomination was Howell's if he wanted it. Howell, however, decided to run as an independent again. He thought being an independent would help in the traditionally Republican Mountain Valley counties where Democrat label might be harmful. Just a year after the 1972 presidential election, in which Democratic candidate George McGovern was so decisively beaten, Howell did not want to be linked to the losing national candidate. The state Democratic Party commended Howell's candidacy and allowed committees at the congressional district and local levels to endorse Howell if they chose. The Democrats then picked J. Harry Michael for lieutenant governor and renominated sitting Attorney General Andrew Miller for his office. Even with Howell's independent candidacy and the nomination of two moderates, the Virginia Democratic Party was becoming more liberal and aligning itself with the National Democratic Party. The Republicans were in worse shape than the Democrats. They had no candidate to run against Howell, whose popularity cut across traditional liberal-conservative lines. Governor Holton could not succeed himself, and he did not have the support of the new conservative movement within the party. This conservative leadership, led by Republican State Chairman Richard Obenshain, determined that the Republican Party should nominate former Democratic Governor Mills Godwin. Godwin opposed the liberal left shift of the state Democratic Party and the liberal policies that Howell advocated. To stop the populist Howell, Godwin considered an independent run for governor, but with an endorsement from the Republican Party rather than as its nominee. Godwin hoped to pull moderate and conservative Democrats, especially in rural areas, into an alliance with suburban Republicans. He feared that he would lose those Democratic voters if he ran as a Republican. Obenshain and the Republican leadership were willing to make that endorsement, but the party's rank and file were not. A reluctant Godwin therefore accepted what the reluctant party gave him, the party nomination, in a concerted effort to prevent Howell from winning the governorship. The Republican Party's candidate for lieutenant governor was John Dalton, whose father, Ted Dalton, had been a Republican gubernatorial candidate in 1953 and 1957. And M. Pat Eccles rounded out the Republican ticket as a candidate for Attorney General. The 1973 election continued to change the political landscape that had begun with the Civil Rights Movement, the end of the poll tax, and the collapse of the Byrd Organization. Would it become a more populist liberal political culture cutting across racial and regional boundaries that had heretofore marked Virginia's elections? Or would it become a conservative liberal realignment, one in which former Byrd Democrats would find a new home in the Republican Party? Howell's strength rested in the Tidewater areas, specifically Hampton Roads, and in the old Republican strongholds of southwestern Virginia. Godwin's lay in northern Virginia, central Virginia around Richmond, and the central Southside Piedmont counties. Both candidates, however, carried baggage. Despite ably filling the lieutenant governor's chair and winning praise for his leadership for the Virginia Senate, Howell was considered a loose cannon, and by running as an independent, he lacked full support of the Democratic Party. Michael and Miller, the two regular party nominees, took a neutral stance in the governor's race. Conversely, Godwin's reluctance to become a Republican hurt him with that party, as well as fear that conservative Democrats would not follow him into the GOP fold. Also, the Watergate scandal from 1972 potentially threatened a loss of voters for Republican candidates. I love this. I did this myself. Unfortunately, I didn't have red for the Republican Party, so I went with orange. In the closest race for governor up to that time, Godwin eked out a close election with 50.7% of the vote to Howell's 49.3%. Republican John Dalton cruised to a comfortable win for lieutenant governor, setting Dalton up as the frontrunner for the 1977 Republican gubernatorial nomination. In winning re-election as Attorney General, Democrat Miller steamrolled Republican Pat Nichols. But the race between Howell and Godwin was extremely close. Godwin won 49 counties and 20 cities, while Howell captured 46 counties and 19 cities. Howell's large margin of victory in the Tidewater cities was virtually erased by Godwin's decisive win in the Richmond area and narrow victory in Northern Virginia. In the rest of the state, Godwin won the rest of his counties and cities by a greater voter margin than Howell won his. So what does the 1973 election signify? One, that Holton's win was not a political aberration, that the old political system as represented by the Byrd organization was long gone. For Democrats, it meant a closer realignment with the National Party on political issues. Liberals and African Americans became more influential in the party, and any candidate had to appeal to those constituencies. The strength of the party shifted toward urban settings and away from rural counties that often were the backbone of the Byrd democracy. For the Republican Party, the election symbolized the results of Richard Obenshain's attempt to remake the party into a home for disaffected conservative Democrats and to end the run of the traditional Mountain Valley GOP leadership that seemingly prized pragmatism over ideology. With this conservative Republican shift came the loss of the party's African American members who moved into the Democratic column. One what if that political analyst Larry Sabato raised is, what if J. Sergeant Reynolds hadn't died? Extremely popular and respected, Reynolds almost certainly would have been the 1973 Democratic nominee. Howell would not have been lieutenant governor, and Godwin would not have run, and Obenshain probably wouldn't have made as strong a pitch for conservative Democrats. This doesn't mean that Republicans wouldn't have continued to make political gains in Virginia, but the dramatic confrontation that the 1973 gubernatorial election represented wouldn't have occurred. The political realignment that began in the 1960s would have been slower. The 1973 governor's race was close and dramatic. The 1978 U.S. Senate race proved to be even more so. Now, almost 40 years later, it is often remembered as the campaign that propelled John Warner into a 30-year Senate career. But often forgotten is that Warner was not the Republican Party's original nominee. The campaign saw a taut and bruising GOP convention, a tragic accident, and a nip and tuck general election before Warner, a political novice, would be sworn in as U.S. Senator from Virginia. The campaign that resulted in his election may be the most interesting, tense campaign in the 20th century in Virginia. In 1972, Richard Obenshain coordinated the election of Republican challenger William Scott to the United States Senate over Democratic incumbent William Spong. This upset helped lay the foundation for Obenshain's redrawing of the state Republican and Democratic parties more in line with their national counterparts, conservative and liberal. Obenshain brought Mills Godwin into the Republican Party to win the governorship in 1973. John Dalton, Godwin's lieutenant governor, succeeded him in the governor's chair in 1977, but Obenshain stumbled when his candidates for lieutenant governor and attorney general were rejected by the GOP convention that year. In 1978, the Republican Party decided they could not continue supporting William Scott as senator, and he decided to retire. Obenshain decided to run for the U.S. Senate himself. By 1978, Obenshain had been active in Virginia Republican politics for over 25 years. Obenshain thought that the Virginia GOP could become the home to conservative state Democrats who no longer held the same political views as a more liberal national party. But Virginia was still in the grip of a Democratic machine which maintained a strict party discipline at the state level, even while supporting Republican presidential contenders. Hoping to make inroads, Obenshain ran for Congress in the Richmond area 3rd District in 1964, but lost a close three-way race. Obenshain ran for Attorney General in 1969 on the same ticket as Linwood Holton, but fell short of election. Obenshain felt that he had not been given proper support by Holton, the head of the ticket. This spurred him to remake the Republican Party by challenging the more traditional and moderate Republican leadership for party control. Having guided the party to significant wins in 2 governor's races and 1 U.S. Senate race, Obenshain believed 1978 to be his time to claim an election victory. Blocking his path was Linwood Holton, who had broken the Democratic grip on statewide office in 1969. Holton had entered politics supporting Dwight Eisenhower for president in 1952. He opposed massive resistance and worked to build a state Republican Party that would be progressive on race relations, but would draw strength from the political center and just right-of-center voters. After failing to win election to the House of Delegates in the 1950s, Holton worked for the Republican Party and received this nod for governor in 1965, losing to Godwin, but then winning his historic election in 1969. As governor, Holton worked to improve race relations in the state, and he also worked well with the Democratic opposition in the legislature. A popular former governor, Holton saw himself as a leader of the state Republican Party and intended to wrest control from Obenshain and steer it back toward the political middle. 2 other candidates entered the ranks for the Senate nomination. One was Nathan Miller, a young rising star in the Virginia GOP, who had recently upset a Democratic incumbent for a seat in the state Senate. Miller hoped that Obenshain and Holton would deadlock the convention and that he would benefit by winning the nomination as a dark horse candidate. The 4th candidate for the seat was John Warner. Born in Washington, D.C., he attended Washington and Lee and the University of Virginia Law School. He had worked for the Nixon campaigns in 1960 and 1968 and had served as Undersecretary of the Navy from 1969 to 1972 when Nixon appointed him Secretary. In 1974, Nixon appointed him to head the Bicentennial Commission. Warner had married Catherine Mellon, daughter of industrialist Paul Mellon, who resided in Fauquier County, a marriage that proved to be financially advantageous for Warner. After their divorce, Warner married Hollywood legend Elizabeth Taylor. Each candidate had his shortcomings. Warner had no political experience and Miller had little more, but their failings paled in comparison to Obenshain's and Holton's. Obenshain was seen as too conservative, and he carried the baggage of his 2 failed campaigns. Holton was perceived as too moderate and was unliked by many of the conservative members of the party. But those 2, Obenshain and Holton, were the titans of the Republican Party, the man who was the first Republican governor since Reconstruction and the man hailed as the architect of the modern Virginia GOP. It seemed that one of these 2 men would be chosen the Republican nominee for Virginia's U.S. Senate seat at the GOP convention. A fight developed, but not between Obenshain and Holton, but between Obenshain and Warner. Warner proved to be an adept campaigner leading up to the convention and was also willing to spend his own money in pursuit of the nomination. His wife also proved to be a valuable asset. Elizabeth Taylor carried the glamour of a Hollywood movie star and wielded her fame as a campaign tool for her husband. Warner's pre-convention campaign, his money, his enthusiasm, and yes, his wife, propelled him to a second-place finish on the first convention ballot with 853 votes. Obenshain, as expected, garnered the most votes with 1,192. Holton, however, didn't fare well, gathering only 780 votes for a third-place finish, while Miller collected 252. Holton's trouble only increased on the second ballot. Both Obenshain, with 1,261 votes, and Warner with 908 votes, increased their first ballot totals. Holton's total dropped to 751, while Miller's declined to 160. For Holton to win the nomination, he needed to surpass Warner's vote total on the second ballot, and he failed. Even an appeal to the Republicans of the old Fighting Ninth Congressional District, home of the traditional Republican heritage that Holton represented, didn't help. On the third ballot, Holton's total dropped to 620, while Obenshain's total rose to 1,338 and Warner's to 996. Miller again brought up the rear with 122 votes. Holton saw the proverbial writing on the wall after the third ballot and decided to withdraw from the race, and he never ran for office again. With Holton out of the race, the intensity increased. Who would benefit most from his withdrawal, Obenshain or Warner? After the fourth ballot was counted, Obenshain was only 20 votes from the necessary 1,541 votes to secure the nomination. Warner made a great leap up to 1,338 votes, while Miller's count rose to 201 votes. On the fifth ballot, Obenshain's momentum stalled and his total dropped to 1,516, while Warner's increased to 1,393. Miller's declined to 166. Had Obenshain lost the momentum, could Warner pull off the upset and secure the nomination? Before the sixth ballot, Miller withdrew his name from contention, and enough of his supporters switched to Obenshain to give him 1,579 votes, 38 more than needed to claim the nomination. Warner then moved that the nomination be unanimous. Richard Obenshain was set to run for the U.S. Senate. His opponent, Andrew Miller, had been nominated by the Democratic Party at its convention. Although it took 3 ballots to nominate him, the convention lacked the drama of the Republican convention. The son of Francis Pickens Miller, a Democrat who had opposed the Byrd Organization in the late 1940s and early 1950s, Miller mended fences with the more orthodox elements in the Democratic Party. He defeated Obenshain comfortably in 1969 to become Virginia's Attorney General and easily won re-election in 1973. Although he had lost a bitterly contested primary for the Democratic nomination for governor to Henry Howell in 1977, Miller was the best known of the Virginia Democrats. Miller intended to claim the political center and depict Obenshain as too far right, a strategy used against the Republican at the GOP convention with some success. Obenshain planned to tie Miller to the administration of President Jimmy Carter and label him as too liberal for Virginia. Early polling put Miller ahead in the race, but Obenshain, a resilient campaigner, closed the gap. Then, unexpectedly on August 2nd, the small plane carrying Obenshain from a campaign stop crashed in Chesterfield County just short of the airport there, killing him and 2 others. Obenshain's death threw the Republican Party into disarray as their campaign stopped. Miller suspended his campaign in respect to his deceased opponent, and the next day, Miller's father died at the age of 83. With both campaigns suspended amidst the 2 deaths, attention turned to who would assume the Republican mantle. Warner, as the runner-up, seemed to be the logical choice, but many conservatives considered him too moderate. Some even preferred Holton over Warner, but the former governor removed himself from consideration. Others, including former Governor Godwin, were approached by the GOP leadership, but all declined to run. In meetings with Obenshain's campaign staff and with the party leadership, Warner assuaged them by saying and doing the right things, first and foremost pledging to help with the Obenshain campaign debt. The party leadership decided that Warner would replace Obenshain and the election geared back up. For Miller, the objective now was to portray Warner as an outsider, not a Virginian, and for Warner it was to continue to link Miller to the National Democratic Party and President Carter. Election day saw the closest statewide contest up to that point. Miller won 52 counties in 26 cities, while Warner won only 43 counties in 15 cities. At first glance, it seemed that Miller won, and early on Tuesday night of the election, Warner considered conceding. But as the results came in, Warner would win the election by 4,721 votes, 50.2% to 49.8%. In the counties and cities that Miller claimed, he won with 55% of the vote. Warner won his 43 counties and 15 cities with 58% of the vote. Although Warner won the Northern Virginia metropolitan region right around Washington, with 52% of the vote, and won Hampton Roads with 53.5% of the vote, his gains there were more than offset by Warner's win in the Richmond metropolitan area with 60% of the vote. Warner won his counties and cities by a wider margin than Miller won his, and that ended up being the deciding factor in the election. Warner would win election as senator 4 more times, receiving a mild challenge only once from now Senator Mark Warner in 1996, defeating him with 52.5% of the vote to 47.1. When Mark won his seat in 2008, it was to John's former seat that opened up due to his retirement after 30 years of service. The unanswered question is, would Obenshain have beaten Miller? Many of Obenshain's close associates and Republican pundits say yes, and by a much greater margin than Warner did. While Obenshain might have won the election, it wasn't the certainty that many came to see in hindsight. Despite being the architect of the modern Virginia Republican Party and the author of its successes in statewide races, he had never won election to office himself. Obenshain had won a congressional run in 1964 and lost to Miller for Attorney General in 1969 by over 50,000 votes. In his bid for the Republican nomination for Senate, he needed 6 ballots to finally defeat a political unknown in Warner. Obenshain's death hurt the Republican Party, because under his leadership in the 1970s, the GOP had increased its membership in the General Assembly and made strong headway in congressional elections. The party made significant strides in statewide elections, winning 2 governorships and 1 Senate seat. With his death, the GOP's momentum stalled in statewide elections entering the 1980s. After I had done this talk and everything, I was working on a collection, and I came across this. And there is a mistake on this ballot. I don't know. I'll give you a minute. Take a look at it. If you think you know what it is, you can kind of raise your hand. Don't worry, I'll give you the answer. But there's one mistake on that ballot. Pardon? Yeah. Pardon? Right. Brendan's correct. Wrong lieutenant governor. The gentleman here is Nathan Miller, Republican candidate for lieutenant governor. After Richard Obenshain's death and John Warner's election, I should say that Brent was probably the only one I figured who would actually know that. But anyway, after Richard Obenshain's death and John Warner's election, the Virginia GOP lost some momentum. Elected lieutenant governor in 1977, Charles S. Chuck Robb bridged the Democratic Party gap between Miller conservative moderates and Howell liberal populists while reaching out to the state's African American voters. He led the Democratic Party to a sweep of statewide offices in 1981. The Virginia GOP claimed a close U.S. Senate race to succeed independent Harry F. Byrd Jr. in 1982, electing Congressman Paul Tribble, while John Warner easily gained re-election to the Senate in 1984. The Democratic Party retained its hold on the 3 top statewide offices in 1985 as Gerald Beliles defeated Wyatt Durrett for governor. Mary Sue Terry, a member of the House of Delegates from Patrick County, won the Attorney General race easily. And L. Douglas Wilder, state senator from Richmond, became Virginia's first African-American statewide office holder by winning the lieutenant governor's race. Wilder's election placed him on the next step toward an historic first, becoming the first African-American governor in U.S. history by winning the closest race for the office in state history. Lawrence Douglas Wilder was born in Richmond in 1931. Wilder states that his family, especially his mother, made sure he received a good education and that he had a stable home life. Despite his circumstances growing up, Wilder understood that African Americans faced rampant discrimination and segregation laws that treated them as less than equal. Wilder attended Virginia Union here in Richmond and graduated in 1951. In 1952, Wilder entered the recently integrated Army, the first time he really lived and interacted with whites. He served on the front lines in Korea, receiving a Bronze Star. Wilder returned to a segregated Virginia, about to embark on the experiment of massive resistance to the Supreme Court ruling in Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas. Inspired in part by the Brown decision, Wilder decided to become a lawyer. With white law schools essentially closed to him, Wilder attended Howard University Law School and graduated in 1959. He passed the bar and began practicing law in Richmond. He built a successful law practice in the Richmond black community during the 1960s. At that time, he became more involved in politics. Wilder felt that often African Americans were just told to vote a certain way by black leaders, and he decided that he needed to show them that they had a stake in the political process and had to understand it. In 1967, William Ferguson Reed was elected to the House of Delegates, the first African American to sit in the Assembly since 1890. Wilder, now more active in politics, decided in 1969 to run for the Richmond Senate seat vacated by J. Sargent Reynolds. Wilder considered himself a candidate bridging the political gap between blacks and whites. He comfortably won a three-way contest, collecting about 49% of the vote. Wilder had won with most of the black vote and a fair portion of the white vote. He was now the first African American to sit in the Virginia Senate in 80 years. In 1985, he was elected lieutenant governor. In 1989, he became the first African American candidate nominated for office of governor by the Virginia Democratic Party. His opponent, J. Marshall Coleman, was born in Stanton in 1942. Coleman received the education that Wilder was seemingly denied, graduating from the University of Virginia in 1964 and earned his law degree from UVA's law school in 1970. Like Wilder, Coleman served in the military. A member of the U.S. Marines from 1966 to 1969, he spent 13 months in Vietnam in combat. After returning home to civilian life and graduating from law school, Coleman quickly entered politics, winning election to the House of Delegates from Stanton, then making the jump to the state Senate. In 1977, he challenged and defeated Richard Obenshain's choice for the Republican nominee as Attorney General, Wyatt Durrett, and then topped Democrat Ed Lane in the general election. Coleman squared off against Democratic Lieutenant Governor Chuck Robb for governor in 1981. Coleman's defeat of the conservatives' choice 4 years earlier now hurt him in the general election. From Stanton, he fell into the more traditional Mountain Valley GOP moderate heritage that many Republican conservatives opposed. Some of his decisions as Attorney General did not sit well with them, one being a compromise with the Federal Department of Health, Education, and Welfare that ended a dispute over the integration of Virginia's institutions of higher education, of which one element was a numbers-based enrollment goal. Conservatives saw this as applying racial quotas. The Republican faced a number of defections from the party conservatives that damaged him during the campaign. Robb benefited from this split by gaining financial support from former Democrats during the race. And on Election Day, Coleman lost to Robb. After a failed bid for the GOP nomination for lieutenant governor in 1985, Coleman determined to secure the Republican nomination for governor in 1989. The GOP frontrunner for the nomination was Paul Tribble, who had won the election to the U.S. Senate in 1982, but chose not to run in 1988. Tribble cited his desire to spend more time with his family, although many felt that he was unwilling to face Chuck Robb in an election. With Tribble's withdrawal, Robb won the Senate seat, and this damaged Tribble in the eyes of many Republicans. Unlike in past years, the GOP held a primary election in which Coleman narrowly defeated Tribble, the favorite, and Congressman Stan Paris. Wilder planned to run from a center-left position, as fiscally conservative but socially liberal. His message was, "We've come too far to turn back now." While it certainly pertained to how far Virginia had come on race relations, an African American running for the state's highest office, it also dealt with the economic growth the state had undergone while Democrats Robb and Baliles were governors. Wilder vowed to continue this economic expansion. Coleman attacked Wilder for being soft on crime, but the Democratic contender parried this by noting his own party criticized his position on the death penalty for murders of police officers. Abortion as an issue also helped Wilder, who supported a woman's right to choose whether to have an abortion, while Coleman opposed abortion in all cases, including rape and incest. Wilder felt that he could beat Coleman on this issue, arguing that a majority of Virginians opposed abortion restrictions beyond parental notification for minors. Coleman used an ongoing coal strike in southwestern Virginia against Wilder. Campaigning there, Wilder had expressed sympathy with the strikers' plight, and Coleman contended that this showed Wilder would reverse Virginia's right-to-work law. Wilder would carry the 5 counties where the strike occurred, but the charge worked against him elsewhere. Both candidates tiptoed around the issue of race, but it was present during the campaign. Wilder argued that he was not running as someone who wanted to be the first African-American governor in Virginia and the nation, but that he was a candidate who just happened to be African-American. Coleman complained that the press gave Wilder a free pass, that they were overlooking Wilder's flaws and problems and focusing on the historic significance of his potential win. Implicit in Coleman's complaint was the issue of race. Wilder later commented that he felt Coleman was saying Wilder's election would be the, quote, height of affirmative action. Race did play a factor in the election, increasing African-American voter turnout and driving some whites away from Wilder. But it's difficult to quantify the negative racial impact, however. Going into Election Day, Wilder was ahead by many polls by about a 9-point average, while a Washington Post poll gave him a 15-point lead. But the final tally was much closer, and election night added more drama. As the results streamed in, Wilder appeared to have a roughly 20,000 vote lead. At 9:45 p.m., return updates stopped for almost an hour. Then an announcement was made that some precincts had been incorrectly tabulated. When the new tallies ran, Wilder's lead had been cut by 2/3. With Wilder's lead reduced to about 6,500 votes, Coleman did not concede the election even as Wilder claimed victory. Wilder's victory would not be officially confirmed until December 20th, with Wilder declared winner by a 6,741 vote margin, 50.2% to 49.8% of the vote, the closest race for governor in Virginia's history. Wilder's ticket mates won their elections more comfortably. Don Beyer, a businessman from northern Virginia, comfortably won election as lieutenant governor, and Mary Sue Terry easily won re-election as attorney general. In winning, Wilder had claimed only 22 of Virginia's counties and 22 cities, but he won 59% of the vote in those cities and counties, while Coleman had won 58% of the vote in the counties and cities he carried. In northern Virginia, Wilder won 6 of 9 cities and counties, including Fairfax County, by over 27,000 votes, claiming that region by 57.4% margin. Carrying 57.4% of the vote. Wilder also carried 5 of the 6 cities in the Hampton Roads area, losing only Virginia Beach, and gained 56% of the vote in that region. Coleman claimed the Richmond area with 53.4% of the vote, losing the capital city, but comfortably claiming the surrounding counties. Wilder's greatest strength lay in the urban areas, where he won 68.5% of the vote, and the large returns in these areas offset the deficits Wilder had in the more numerous but less populated localities. The African American vote, about 17% of the population, increased dramatically from 1985, with about 73% of registered black voters casting ballots, compared to 65% of white voters. Larry Sabato estimates that Wilder won 96% of the African American votes cast, and that he garnered 41% of the white votes cast. Sabato also estimates that Wilder won 53% of women voters, while Coleman won 53% of men voters. Wilder also performed better with younger voters. The disparities between Wilder's margin of victory and his fellow Democrats' margins indicate that many white voters split their ballots, voting Republican for governor and Democratic for the other two offices. The speculation at the time was that there was still a fair number of white Virginians who otherwise supported the Democratic Party but could not vote for Wilder. One problem that might have hampered Wilder with the Democratic constituency was a feud between Wilder and Chuck Robb. Now, of course, the irony of this election was not missed. Wilder, the Democratic candidate, represented the state party that had politically marginalized African American voters in the state constitution of 1902. But he represented how the party had changed since Harry F. Byrd died in 1966. Like the National Democratic Party, the state party shifted on the political spectrum to become more liberal. It had become the home for African Americans as white conservative Virginians left the party of their fathers. Wilder's nomination represented the two political parties' role reversal that had begun more than 20 years earlier. As the Democratic Party depended less and less on the old guard Byrd organization veterans, the Virginia Republican Party welcomed them into the GOP, sometimes at the cost to its earlier leadership and traditions. It is likely that were a Byrd Democrat transported from 1929 to 1989, he would have found himself more at home in the Republican Party of the time, while an African American from the same time would have found himself pleasantly and greatly surprised that the Byrd Party had run and elected a black governor. Wilder tossed his hat into the Democratic primary in 1991, a move which hurt him in the state. Even many of his supporters felt that he was wasting his time on a quixotic pursuit when he should have been governing Virginia. Wilder remains a political maverick in the state Democratic Party, publicly feuding with Robb and at times not hewing the party line in endorsing candidates. In 2004, Wilder was the first popularly elected mayor of Richmond since the 1940s. Coleman's political denouement took place during the 1994 U.S. Senate campaign. An embattled Chuck Robb was running for re-election against Oliver North, the controversial Iran-Contra affair figure. John Warner, opposing North, recruited Coleman to enter the Senate race. Coleman collected 11.4% of the vote, which swung the race to Robb, who had 45.6% of the vote. Coleman offered many Republicans who could not vote for Robb but could not stomach North an alternative. And I ran across this in another collection I was working on, and this is from 1988 when Coleman was gearing up his campaign for governor, and obviously at the time was willing to be very friendly with North, but obviously 6 years later, not so much. So that's three elections that highlight the changes in Virginia politics. Where once the political machine of one party dominated most state races, there is now strong competition for statewide offices. These three races, which could have gone the other way with changes in a few thousand votes, are not even the closest races in Virginia's post-Byrd history. Jim Webb upended George Allen's 2006 re-election bid to the U.S. Senate by now 9,329 votes, 49.6% to 49.2%. Twice in the last 11 years, the Attorney General's race came down to a mere hundreds of votes to determine the winner. In 2005, Republican Bob McDonnell defeated Democratic Creed Deeds by 323 votes, and in 2013, Democratic Mark Herring defeated Republican Mark Obenshain, son of Richard Obenshain, by a mere 165 votes. While the Virginia House of Delegates is now dominated by the Republican Party, which took control of it in 1999, the Virginia Senate remains seesawing between the two parties. Both parties have elected 3 governors since Doug Wilder's term: George Allen, Jim Gilmore, and Bob McDonnell for the Republicans, and Mark Warner, Tim Kaine, and Terry McAuliffe for the Democrats. Currently, the state congressional district consists of 8 Republicans and 3 Democrats, a shift from 50 years ago when the balance was 8 Democrats and 2 Republicans. The Democrats have been a Virginia congressional minority since 2001. In the United States Senate, Republican John Warner held his Senate seat for 30 years from 1979 to 2009. On John's retirement, Democrat Mark Warner won the seat in 2008 and re-election in 2014. The state's other Senate seat has been held by 5 different men since 1983. Republicans Paul Tribble and George Allen, and Democrats Chuck Robb, Jim Webb, and Tim Kaine. After Harry Byrd and the state Democratic Party split from National Democratic Party, Virginia was carried only once by a Democratic presidential candidate between 1948 and 2008, Lyndon Johnson in 1964. In the last 2 elections, 2008 and 2012, however, Democratic candidate Barack Obama has carried the state with a majority both times. The state that elected the first black governor in the nation supported the first African-American president twice, a far cry from the politics of the Byrd democracy. Virginia is now a battleground state. Thank you.